Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. If the current projections of increasing the global population from 7.3 billion to approximately 9.7 billion by 2050 come true, what will be the impact on dealing with problems such as climate change? What will be the impact on various market economies as well as retirement systems? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at the population projections, population increase, and the impact that this will have on a variety of issues that affect all of us around the world. My guest today is an expert. My guest today is Mr. John Wilmoth. Mr. John Wilmoth is the Director of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division at the United Nations. Previously, Mr. Wilmoth served as professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author or co-author of more than 50 scientific papers on various aspects of population dynamics. Mr. John Wilmoth, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Your office, the Population Division within the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, has done you've done several interesting studies, but a most recent one deals with the population expansion that's going to take place probably over the next 30, 35 years, something like that. And the title of it is World Population Prospects, Key Findings and Advanced Tables, 2015 revision. This is a really interesting study. It's very readable. The key provisions are provided in like 4 pages, which makes it even more readable. What are some of the major findings? Let's just start off with the key one. I mentioned in the opening about moving from 7.3 billion to estimated to approximately 9.7 billion by 2050. What exactly how is this population growth going to occur? What will be the areas that will be mostly affected by the increases?
Well, the growth is occurring essentially because we've reduced the death rate historically, and people live longer, and children survive to adulthood in much greater numbers than they did in the past. And this sparked a period of population growth in human history that's been unprecedented. And then this has happened all around the world. But in many parts of the world, the death rate came down, and eventually the fertility rate came down as well. So we reduced the number of deaths that were happening every year, but we also reduced the number of births. And population then kind of reached a new sort of equilibrium at a lower level of fertility and mortality. But there are some parts of the world today where the reduction in the death rate has been quite substantial, but the reduction in the fertility rate hasn't caught up with that yet. And so, for example, across much of sub-Saharan Africa, this is the case, where there are still several countries that have fertility levels that exceed 5 children per woman. And yet this is in a context where child survival has improved substantially over the last 40 years. And more children survive through childhood to adulthood. And it's no longer necessary, in some sense, just demographically speaking, to replace them by having high levels of fertility. So the populations could stabilize with much lower levels of fertility than what is being observed today. So of the growth that you're speaking of from now until 2050, rising from about 7.3 billion to 9.7, more than half of that growth will occur in Africa. In other parts of the world, there's continued growth in most parts of the world, but at a much reduced level. Another substantial portion of the growth will occur in Asia. The only part of the world that's actually shrinking in size in terms of population is Europe over this time period. We expect a slight decrease for the European population over this time period.
Mm-hmm. Now, of these, you were alluding to 21 countries, I believe, that have the fertility rate of 5 children per woman. What are there special challenges that these countries will confront if that level does not come down? If it say stays at 6 or 7.5 children per woman, are there certain challenges that will have to confront? They will need to confront.
Well, yes. The thing about population growth and high fertility is that it's not only that you're adding more and more people every year, you're adding more and more young people, babies are being born every year. The number of babies being born is perhaps 3% higher than the year before. So each additional cohort is larger than the previous one. And so all of the ways that we act as a society to incorporate these new members into our societies has to be expanded. We're talking about educational systems, healthcare systems, and eventually employment opportunities for young people. And so the challenge comes from the fact that many of the countries that still have these high levels of fertility and rapid population growth are also some areas that are amongst the least developed countries of the world, the poorest countries with perhaps the least well-developed educational systems and healthcare systems and so forth. And they need to focus on building those systems and providing better for the needs of their populations. But that already in itself is a challenge to expand those systems and make them better. But then if in addition you have to accommodate an ever-increasing cohorts of young people, that's what provides the challenge. So it makes it more difficult to improve the quality of the systems because you're always chasing after increasing quantity as well.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, to have zero population growth, to maintain the population at the current level, it would be on average around the world 2.1 children per woman in order to do that. Now, there are, I believe, about 83 countries that are below that level right now, which you've alluded to. What are some of the challenges they're going to be confronting? And I mentioned this in the area of how will that affect their market economy? How will it affect their retirement systems? Because retirement systems such as the Social Security system, most of them are built on the foundation of younger workers putting money into the system to help the older workers draw their benefits, and so you need a larger pool. What will be the impact on, let's say, the market economy and on the retirement systems in many countries of those 83 that I mentioned?
Sure. Well, what's interesting to note is those 83 countries that now have fertility levels below 2.1 children per woman. Well, first let me say that 2.1 children, that's the number of children that are needed to replace the parents' generation in a situation where you have relatively low mortality, where children survive to adulthood and where adults survive to old age. In populations with higher mortality, you actually need a few more, slightly 2.3 or 2.4 children in order to accommodate the loss from mortality. But if a population is below that level of 2.1, then in the long run, it's going to start decreasing in size unless you make up for the lower birth rate by having a high level of immigration. That's a possibility. But if you rule that out and you just think what's going to happen to the population, eventually it's going to start to decrease in size. And in any case, it's going to start to become much older. And from the perspective of population growth, many people applaud this and they say, well, this is great. This is what we need. We need a smaller world population in order to reduce the impact of human activities on the ecosystem of the Earth. And there's some truth to that. But that issue is quite complicated, and you have to get into the fact that the increase in human activity is partly due to population growth, but it's especially due to changes in habits and how much we consume per capita. And we could have a smaller population of 4 billion people, but we would still potentially have a very big impact on the Earth, especially if those 4 billion people consume at the high levels that we observe in North America or Europe or Japan or some other countries of the world. So on the one hand, you might say, well, this is a good thing, low fertility, reducing population growth. But the thing to keep in mind is that just as with high fertility, you have a very young population, with low fertility, you go eventually toward having a much older population. And if you just maintain a stable birth rate that keeps you at around 2.1 children per woman, then it actually leads to kind of a stable population age structure that's relatively balanced across the age range. But when you fall below that level, and some countries now have fertility rates below 1.5 children per woman, even down close to 1 in some cases, you almost get an inverted age distribution where you end up having more people at older ages than at younger ages, potentially. This situation of population aging and the increasing size of the older population has become a cause of great concern. And in fact, I've said that for many countries of the world in the future, the major concern will not be population growth, but rather population aging. And you alluded to the problems. Obviously, the older population, at some point, most of us become dependent in the sense that it's hard for us to take care of all of our own affairs, and we need economic support and social support and medical care and so forth. And this has to be provided ultimately by the working age population. And so it's the ratio of workers to retirees that matters, this potential support ratio. And when social security systems are established by countries, it's often based on the assumptions of the world as they knew it at that time, when there was kind of an abundance of workers relative to retirees. But as this process of population aging progresses, then there are more and more older people per worker, and it does become challenging. But it's not a death sentence by any means. Countries can adapt to this. But they have to do it slowly over time. They need to build these systems. They may need to kind of make them in a way that's adaptable. For example, making adjustments in the retirement age that take account of the fact that you have more and more people living to older ages, and they're healthier, so they can continue to work longer. But if it happens in an extreme way, through very low levels of fertility, with really rapid movement toward population aging, it does become more challenging. So I often say it's a problem of the extremes. Population trends per se are not good or bad, but they're challenging when they push toward the extreme of very high fertility and rapid growth in very young populations, or very low fertility and rapid population aging and progressively older populations.
And our viewers can get more information by going to unpopulation.org. That's one word, unpopulation.org, and locate your report, other reports you've done, and many other articles, I'm sure, on this topic, and probably several others too. You're talking about the climate change, the carbon footprint, and that's very interesting because there are some demographers and scientists who are saying we should try to reduce voluntarily, not through draconian tactics or anything, but voluntarily reduce the population. But you made a very important point. Even if we went from 7.3 billion to 4.3 billion, if we're still using fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, we're still leaving a huge carbon footprint that's going to create really major, it's already have created major environmental problems. So the key is to become more green, I guess, to develop better ways to provide energy to people, to perhaps raise the standard of living without creating that carbon footprint.
That's correct. Really, we have to change the way that we live. There's no going back to a population of less than 1 billion people on this planet. It's just not impossible. It's not going to happen. And so it's really important to accept, in some sense, that there's sort of a demographic foundation of our society, of our planet, and we have to live with that. And that inevitably means changing the ways that we live, and not somehow hoping that a reduction in human numbers will solve the problem. It won't.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to see previous programs, and also to perhaps make recommendations for future guests and topics. Today we're taking a look at the increasing populations, which the increasing population is happening around the world, and what some of the effects are. My guest today is an expert on that. My guest is Mr. John Wilmoth. Mr. John Wilmoth is the Director of the Department for Economic and Social Affairs Population Division at the United Nations. We're talking about population increase, talking about that carbon footprint, and the key is to really reduce that carbon footprint. That's what we have to do, move into alternative forms of energy, green forms of energy. We can help raise people's, or improve their lifestyles, improve the quality of life, their standard of living, but do it in a very ecologically, environmentally friendly way, as opposed to perhaps the way we've been doing it in the past. But as I looked at your report too, there are several positive things. That one, we're living longer. You've mentioned that earlier. I think on average it's like from 2000 to today, there was an increase of like 3 years more of life longevity. What does that impact have, and which countries are affected by that? Not every country, I'm sure, is, but on average, how many or what percentage of the countries are living longer? In some conditions, perhaps due to civil wars or whatever, the life expectancy is not quite as long.
Well, if you, with just a handful of exceptions of countries that are involved in civil conflicts and other epidemiologic disasters like Ebola, if you put aside those, it's universal. This is one of the great good news stories of our time, is the continued increase in the human lifespan, which reflects improvements in nutrition, improvements in the quality of life and sanitation systems and medical care. All of these things kind of work together to increase the length of life. And this has been going on for more than 200 years, actually, across the world. It's been a slow process. And it seems to be one thing that everyone agrees on here at the UN. Maybe it's hard to find a topic where everybody can agree, but I think everyone agrees that living longer is a good thing. It has been very widely shared, even in the poorest countries of the world. And in fact, one piece of good news that comes out of this report is that there's been a small reduction in the gap in life expectancy at birth between the least developed countries and the rest of the world. So the least developed countries had an increase of life expectancy over 10 years, from the early 2000s to the early 2010s, of around 6 years in terms of life expectancy at birth. So an extension of 6 more years of life. This is very good. This is a very rapid pace of change. For the world as a whole, the increase was 3 years, I believe you mentioned. So that reflects a reduction, at least a slight reduction, in the gap that exists. And we're very focused on inequality here at the UN, and reducing inequality is taken to be a good thing. But despite that reduction that we've observed in the gap, there's still a rather large gap between the most advantaged and the least advantaged countries of the world. So, for example, now for the continent of Africa as a whole, life expectancy is around 60 years, whereas for North America, where we are here today, it's around 79 years. So a gap of 19 years between these two large regions of the world. So we still have a long way to go in terms of reducing the inequality that affects people's health and longevity. But we have made some progress.
Speaking of agreements, there are 193 member states, governments, that are part of the United Nations General Assembly. And in 2000, most of them agreed to go with the Millennium Development Goals over a 15-year period. 8 logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, to promote sustainable development, and 4 others. Those goals expire December 31st, 2015, and the new Sustainable Development Goals with the Development Agenda 2030 will come in with 17 new goals built on the 8 Millennium Development Goals with, I think, 169 targets, something like that.
That's right.
We won't go through all of them today, but how do they factor in? What are some of the key ones that are factoring into what you're doing in the Population Division?
Well, in the Population Division, we've been focused on some of these core goals and targets of the Millennium Development Goals. We work on things like child mortality and maternal mortality, and also fertility levels, adolescent fertility, and contraceptive prevalence. These are all things that we have been tracking as part of the MDGs. They're part of that core set of development indicators that, as you mentioned, poverty, education, mortality, gender equality. These were the things that kind of everyone could agree on needed to be changed and became part of the Millennium Development Goals. Now we have a much broader agenda that it covers economic, social, and environmental aspects of development. And it's designed to be universal, to cover all countries of the world, so that it's not just a development agenda for the poor countries, but for really the world as a whole, with a focus on sustainability. And sustainability in this case, in the old sense, it's still there, that kind of the idea that our grandchildren should have access to a similar quality of life and a similar experience of living on this planet as what we've been able to enjoy. But the notion of sustainability has also been enlarged in this discussion to include the idea that you can't leave anyone behind in this process, that we must reduce inequality, we must include groups that have been excluded, and that no social or economic system is sustainable in the long run unless you do that.
Exactly. And earlier we were talking about the reduced mortality or the fertility rates, and how you have some countries that are not reaching the 2.1. We've seen that immigration is a major issue. You see many immigrants that want to go from Northern Africa into Europe. You see migrants coming from Latin America, Central America into the United States, Canada, and other areas. Because can immigration play a role in the declining population figures in some of these countries?
Well, in terms of rebalancing the growth between fast growth and slow growth areas, it can play a minor role in that regard. It can actually, it's not entirely minor. It's actually minor from the perspective of the countries that these people are leaving. So that's to say, these very rapidly growing areas of the world, and then there's a trickle of migrants that leave those. It's very small numbers compared to the growth that's taking place, and it doesn't really change that. It has much more of an impact in the countries where they're arriving, where it becomes a substantial part of the demographic change that's taking place over time. So you have some countries like Germany, for example, which would be declining in size currently if it were not for immigration. So immigration takes what would be a negative growth rate and makes it a slightly positive growth rate. And so immigration becomes the driver of population change in a country like Germany today, and some other parts of Europe in particular. And it's been important in the United States over several decades as a component of our demographic growth. So immigration is important in that sense, and it also has, for the countries that receive the immigrants, the host countries, immigration has an impact on the age distribution, which we talked about before. And in terms of meeting the challenge of supporting the older population, you want to recruit younger people into your society, and you can do that by having births and raising them and educating them and bringing them up through childhood into adulthood, or you can recruit them when they're about 15 to 30 years old as young workers, and this is another way to kind of rejuvenate and replenish the population at younger ages. So it has overall, I think, a positive effect from a demographic and economic point of view. It presents, international migration presents certain challenges in terms of integrating people in the countries that are receiving them. And in some cases, it can be a challenge in terms of losing skilled personnel from ascending countries. But there are so many positive impacts on the development situation in terms of filling labor gaps in the receiving countries, providing job opportunities in countries that may lack adequate employment opportunities. And also the transmission of ideas and providing links for commerce, that these people really become the ambassadors the economic ambassadors of the world, transferring goods and services and ideas and money across countries in a way which stimulates development. And most economists, I think, see immigration as an important driver of development.
And a large part of this immigration is moving into urban areas. Immigrants move into urban areas. I saw some figures, or a figure, I think by 2050, 75% of the people on the planet will be living in an urban area, and many of these will be megacities, 10 million or more. What will be the special challenges confronting these cities? Because we see today so many cities are choked. I mean, they're absolutely choked. Traffic doesn't move very quickly. I won't go through the whole list, but pick any large urban area around the world and you're going to have this problem. But what are a couple of the challenges the planners will deal with at that particular point, or now in preparation?
Well, I'm not an urban planner, so I don't feel really comfortable speaking about the particularities of that. Our colleagues at UN Habitat are experts in kind of how you build sustainable cities. What we know from the demographic point of view is that most of the growth of the world population will take place in cities, and it will be roughly 2/3 of the world population will be living in cities by 2050. And an interesting factoid is just to think in 1950, it was about 1/3 of the world's population that lived in cities. By 2050, it'll be around 2/3. So we will kind of have inverted the ratio of urban to rural from 1950 to 2050 over this 100-year period of time. And at this point, the populations of rural areas are basically stable. They're not growing over time to any significant degree. So all of the world's population growth at this point is taking place in cities. Like I said earlier, half of it is taking place in Africa. So the growth is very concentrated in certain parts of the world, and within those parts of the world, within the cities. And therefore, this just underlines the importance of attending to the issues of sustainable cities and building them in a way that make them livable and
exactly
pleasant places to be.
Very true, very true. Well, Mr. John Wilmoth, Director of the Population Division in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, commonly called DESA. This is an extremely important topic and one we're going to hear much more about. I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.